This is the Fuji XF 150 to 600mm lens. I've been using this lens now for about 3.5 weeks. I've taken many thousands of photographs with it, and I've given it a really good test outdoors photographing wildlife. I've also taken some other images just to help with my testing of this lens. So now I feel in a really good position to do this review. So just to cover a few important points before I get into my review of this lens, I've bought the lens with my own money. I'm not here to try and influence you to buy the lens, and I'm also not here to try and put you off from purchasing the lens. I'm simply here to do an honest, genuine review, share my thoughts, and share my experiences on using this lens over the last few weeks. And as I said earlier, having shot thousands of images. So we've got lots of images to look at. We've got a few videos to look at as well, some video clips. And yeah, I just want to give my honest, genuine thoughts. It's also important that I point out that any photographs and any video that I've captured using this lens has been when it has been partnered with my Fuji X-T3 camera. So if you were to purchase this lens, what comes with it? Well, obviously you get the lens itself, no surprises there. You also get the rear and front lens caps, as you would expect. And it comes with a tripod collar and tripod collar foot here. And the foot is Arca Swiss compatible. So if you've got a suitable tripod, a matching tripod, that is a great benefit to have. It also comes with this lens pouch, which is quite a nice quality lens pouch actually. I wouldn't expect this obviously to protect the lens if it was dropped from any height or anything like that, but for simply storing the lens when it's not in use, this will certainly do the job. And it also comes with a shoulder strap, which you can see here. It also comes with this lens hood, which has got a small opening here, so you're able to access and turn a circular polarizing filter if you've got one attached to your lens. So let's have a closer look at the lens itself and in terms of its specifications. So it offers a focal length range of 150mm all the way up to 600mm, which is quite considerable. It's weather resistant, it's got an internal zoom, and it's got a variable aperture of f5.6 to f8. The filter thread size is 82mm, and on the front here we've got 4 focus control buttons. On the side here we've got 3 switches, and they are the focus range selector, aperture mode and focus selector. We also have a focus preset button which is labelled set. We can use the focus selector switch to lock focus. If we set it to AF, the 4 focus control buttons now operate the same as the camera's AF on button. We can use the focus preset button to save the current focus position. Once we have done that, we can slide the focus selector switch to preset and then press a focus control button to recall the focus position. This can be very useful in certain situations, but it's not something that I personally am going to use every time I'm out shooting with this lens. So let me move on now and talk about the build quality of the lens. So starting with the aperture ring, this turns nice and smoothly, and there's a lovely soft click at each position which I really like. The zoom ring is substantial, so when you're looking through your EVF it's very easy to find to adjust your zoom, and it turns nice and smooth. There's a good level of resistance to it. It feels just about right to me. The focus ring is very easy to turn, so I would say it feels very light, but it's smooth, it's consistent, and it's very easy for me to adjust my manual focus if I'm using that. The 4 buttons at the front have a nice rubber feel to them. They're of good quality. The button here is nice as well, and the three switches on the side, they all feel very well made. Now I imagine for a company making a lens such as this, they want it to be well made to stand up to being outdoors and being used. They want it to be robust, but they also need to consider keeping the weight down. So I think quite a few parts are made of some type of plastic. I don't have a note of the exact materials, but it's a high quality plastic, and overall the build quality is really good on this lens. The only slight thing that I want to point out, and it's not really an issue, but making the review as honest as I can, this section here, which houses the switches, it's definitely made of some type of plastic material, again I think to keep weight down, and just when you gently press on it, as I'm doing here, you can sense a little bit of movement in it. It's nothing major, it's not a fault, it's not going to break, I don't think it's anything that's going to get worse, but I just think that's part of trying to really save weight, to keep the weight of the lens down. So a very minor point, but overall excellent build quality on this lens. To briefly talk about the accessories that come with the lens, as I touched on earlier, the lens pouch feels well made, it's nice quality, and definitely something I'll keep the lens in when it's not in use. The shoulder strap is also well made and fairly comfortable in terms of comparing it to other straps that I've received with other lenses. So this one offers some degree of comfort. Some people may prefer to order a strap of a design and specification that they feel would suit them better, but for many people I do think this will do the job decently. And finally, the lens hood. This is fairly well made, and the main thing I can say about this one is I think we'll probably all have experienced lens hoods which don't go onto their thread very easily. On the whole, I've found this one very easy to put on and take off the lens itself, so no problems there. So what about general use, handling and performance of this lens when I'm outdoors with it? Well, often I'm used to carrying a camera bag with a number of lenses in it. When I'm out to shoot with this lens, most of the time it's going to be the only lens that I carry with me. So when this is in my backpack with the Fuji X-T3 attached, the backpack feels to me quite light. There's no problems there whatsoever. Regarding weight, this is very much a personal thing. What some folk feel is acceptable or fine, others may struggle with, but I think it's fine in my backpack. In terms of handling, I can certainly hold this lens for long periods of time. Eventually you feel the weight, but compared to other wildlife setups that I've used, this one is fairly light. And in combination of shooting with it while it's in my hand and also having it supported with a shoulder strap, I've been shooting pretty much most of the daylight hours when I've been out, and I've not had any problems. So yeah, it's quite a nice lightweight setup for the focal length range that it offers. Also, being the internal zoom, it's well balanced, so it feels nice in the hand, and it also sits very well balanced on a tripod, so I really like that. No complaints there from me. In terms of performance, I'd just like to talk briefly about how this lens focuses on my subjects in partnership, of course, with my Fuji X-T3 camera. And I've found the combination has done a fantastic job. The autofocus is fairly quick. It's been reliable for me. And yeah, I feel it's a very good performing lens. Now, I would love to test this lens with the Fuji X-H2S camera. I feel I may get even better results there, but knowing how my Fuji X-T3 works with other lenses and so on, I do find that I've had absolutely no focus problems using this lens. I thought it would be important in this review video to talk a little bit about the aperture of this lens. It's a variable aperture from f5.6 to f8. So putting this lens on my Fuji X-T3, I've done some testing to find out at what focal lengths the aperture changes. So I'll put the results of my testing up on screen now for you to have a look at. But I remember when this lens was announced quite some time ago now, there was a lot of talk about the aperture and some people felt it wouldn't be suitable for wildlife. I personally think it is. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But some people thought it would be fine for wildlife. Now I do landscape photography as well, so the variable aperture f5.6 to f8 in terms of my landscape photography doesn't faze me at all. It's absolutely fine, no problems there. For wildlife, it definitely deserves some more thought. Now for me, my own preferences, and this will vary from photographer to photographer, but my own preference is to do my wildlife photography in good light. And for that reason, I'm not finding, and I knew I wouldn't, I'm not finding the f8 aperture. So say I shoot at 600 millimeters, the aperture will be f8. I'm not finding that an issue at all. But it really does depend on what you're shooting and when you're shooting. But for me, and I think many other people, this will work absolutely fine. And in some cases, I actually think the aperture values are right where they need to be. So for example, over the last few weeks, I've shot a lot of small birds. And when I'm at 600 millimeters, and I'm fairly close to those birds, and I'm using the aperture of f8 at 600 millimeters, the depth of field is very small. So when I look at my images, when I review them in the computer, I wouldn't like the depth of field actually to be any smaller. And in some cases, I've actually closed the aperture to say f11 or f13 to get a bit more depth of field. So I think at 600 millimeters, generally speaking, I think f8 is probably, in many cases, not all obviously, but it's about as wide as I'd want to go before I think depth of issue could potentially become an issue for me. But again, that depends on the photographer, depends on your style, it depends on what you're photographing, etc. In terms of the backgrounds behind my subject, I like how they look on this lens. f8's fine for me. I like how they've looked when I've been using f11 and so on. It really depends on your preferences, but for me the separation between subject and background is absolutely fine. And as I said earlier, we have to remember that when we're close to our subjects, we're shooting at 600 millimeters, the depth of field is very small, so it's something we need to consider, but it's been working really well for me. What would worry me about this lens is that if I was shooting at 600 millimeters, I'm fully zoomed in, the aperture is at f8, which is as wide as I can get, and then I went to review my images and I thought they were soft at f8, meaning I had to close the aperture down to say f11 to get acceptable sharpness. That would be an issue for me and I would be a bit worried about that. But I'm really pleased to say that at 600 millimeters and f8, the lens is producing incredibly sharp, incredibly detailed images. And we'll see more of that later when we have a look at some of the images I've been taking over the last few weeks. All this said, this is purely my opinion. This is my preferences as a type of photographer that I am. I can completely understand why some other photographers with different requirements would need something different in terms of the aperture value offered by a lens. So I can see why some photographers would prefer, say, f4 or even f2, which I think the Fuji XF 200mm lens offers. So they may be shooting very early in the morning when there isn't much light, or very late in the evening when there's very little light. they may need, in wildlife photography terms, a reasonably fast shutter speed. So if they had an f2 lens, they could get a reasonably fast shutter speed that they need, and they could open up that aperture to f2, assuming it provided enough depth of field, and they could keep their ISO values at what they deem as an acceptable level. So definitely there is a market for those types of lenses which allow those possibilities, and some wildlife photographers will definitely need them. But for me and what I'm doing in my wildlife photography, it's not essential. Sure, if I could get it on this lens, so say it had a fixed aperture of f4, that would be fantastic. But typically, those types of lenses come at a much more expensive price. They can be bigger if they're still offering this focal length, and they can be heavier as well. So these are just the things that we need to consider. But yeah, this lens is definitely suitable for some wildlife photography. It shouldn't be thought that an f8 lens is no use for wildlife photography in low light conditions, such as early morning or late at night. Here are a couple of photographs to show how the lens can still be used to take nice images. I took this first image of a pheasant purely to test the lens. It was shot approximately 45 minutes after sunrise on an overcast day. Shot handheld at 600mm with an aperture of f8, I used OIS to enable a shutter speed of only 1/160th of a second, and the ISO was 1000. The image is sharp, I can see lots of detail on the bird, and noise isn't an issue. Here is another shot of a roe deer captured 1 hour after sunrise, and again on a cloudy day with little light. This was shot handheld with, in wildlife photography terms, a slow shutter speed and an aperture of f8. The image quality is excellent and noise isn't an issue. Now in both these occasions, had I been photographing a fast moving bird in this poor light which demanded a shutter speed of perhaps 1/2000th of a second or faster, then of course I'd have preferred a wider aperture to get optimal results. However, in these situations, what I had was perfectly fine. Let's talk now about image quality and the image quality offered by this lens. This is obviously really important for our wildlife photography, and indeed any other type of photography that we could be using this lens for. So I'm really pleased to say that I think the image quality offered by this lens is fantastic. All the images that I've captured look great. They seem to offer very pleasing colour and contrast, and they are sharp, and I can see lots of detail on the wildlife that I've been photographing. I'm also really pleased to say, as I believe I touched on earlier, that at 600mm and at f8, which is where many people will be taking a lot of images, it is really sharp. The images are really sharp, so there's no need to close down the aperture to f11, for example. So that's something that's a real benefit on this lens. I've also done some other test shots, not of wildlife, but simply test shots, just to have a look at overall sharpness and edge and corner quality. And it seems to me, across all the apertures, the widest apertures rather, offered by the lens, and across pretty much the entire focal length range, images are really nice and sharp, and I've not noticed on my particular copy of the lens at least any issues at the edges or corners. So I really do think the image quality offered by this lens is fantastic, and it's certainly more than good enough for my needs anyway. So I always think the best way to judge image sharpness or what I think of a lens is simply to go out and shoot real world images. So I've been doing a lot of wildlife photography over the last 3.5 weeks or so. So let's have a look at those images now, and you can see what this lens hopefully is capable of. So I think a lot of Fuji shooters who are in the market for a super telephoto lens, perhaps for wildlife photography, will be making a decision between this lens, the XF 150 to 600mm, and also the Fuji XF 100 to 400mm lens. Possibly, if they're purchasing that lens, they'll go for the 1.4 times teleconverter as well. And it's a tough decision perhaps for some people. Now, I used the 100 to 400mm lens a lot, often and probably most times with a 1.4 times teleconverter. And I have moved completely from that lens to this one. Ideally, I can see some valid reasons for having both. Unfortunately, I can't do that. So I've moved from that lens to totally shooting with this one for my wildlife photography, and also when I need this type of focal length range for my landscapes. So I thought it would be useful to dedicate a little section of this video to giving my thoughts, and they're not scientific comparisons because I've got rid of that lens now, but I just want to give my thoughts and comparisons between my experiences of the two lenses. Let me start by talking about pure image quality of photographs captured using this lens, the newer one, with no teleconverter, versus the slightly older lens, the XF 100 to 400mm, also with no teleconverter. They are both excellent lenses. I've got no problem with either lens regarding image quality. However, if I was really comparing them, I would give a subtle edge to this lens, the newer lens. I do feel it is ever so slightly sharper. However, not everyone will notice that. It depends on a number of factors, such as your monitor and the level of scrutiny that you're giving images. So I definitely don't think sharpness alone from either lens with no teleconverter should influence your buying decision, but I do give a subtle edge to this one. Another important thing is weight. So when you're out carrying a lens such as this all day doing wildlife photography or whatever, weight is important. So the XF 100 to 400 is slightly lighter than this lens. I'll put some figures up on screen now. However, it's not significantly lighter, and if you put on the 1.4 times teleconverter, the weight is incredibly close to being almost identical to this one. So again, I don't think weight is an important factor in your buying decision when you're comparing the two lenses. I do give this one the edge though for overall handling and balance. The internal zoom means the balance is better. I can feel that hand holding, and I notice it when this one is on a tripod as well. In terms of pure focal length, this lens here, the newer lens, obviously has an advantage. So it's got a maximum focal length with no teleconverter of 600mm. The other lens I've been talking about stops at 400mm. However, if you put on the 1.4 times teleconverter to that lens, it then can get all the way up to 560mm. So it edges closer to this one, but it doesn't quite reach the 600mm. When you put the teleconverter onto the 100 to 400 lens, your aperture becomes f6.4 to f8. So if we're starting to compare the maximum focal length, 600mm, you'll be at f8. And if you've got the 100 to 400, using a teleconverter, getting it to 560mm, you're also at f8. So that's a very important thing to consider if you feel that you're someone who will benefit from those longer focal lengths. So comparing this lens with no teleconverter to the 100 to 400 with the teleconverter, I find that although that teleconverter was excellent, I really liked it, it's one of the best teleconverters that I've tried, I do feel that it affected the autofocus a little bit. So this lens here with no teleconverter, for me the autofocus is better than it was in the older lens with the teleconverter. And the other issue is that using the teleconverter, although it was an excellent one, it did affect the image quality slightly. Not a lot, but it definitely affected it slightly. So again, this lens with no teleconverter produces sharper images. So if you, for your photography, perhaps your wildlife photography, feel that 400mm is sufficient focal length, then the XF100-400 does have an advantage because it offers wider apertures, it can let more light in. But if you really think that you're going to benefit from longer focal lengths, so you're going to want the 1.4 times teleconverter on that lens, or you like the sound of 600mm, which is available on this one, I definitely suggest going for this lens over the 100-400 with the 1.4 times teleconverter. My final thoughts on this lens are that it is a really well made, a well balanced lens which helps produce very pleasing, sharp, detailed images. And I think in the hands of the right photographer who knows perhaps the potential limitations of the lens, but also at the other end of the spectrum knows and seizes the opportunities that this lens offers, it is going to be a fantastic tool for producing some really nice high quality images. Now, I'm not someone who would feel comfortable telling you what to buy or not buy with your money, certainly not. But I do hope sharing my honest thoughts and experiences about this lens and having used it over the last 3.5 weeks or so has helped you make some sort of informed decision regarding your thoughts on this lens. If you're new to my channel, perhaps you've not seen the other video that I made a few weeks ago about this lens. I covered my very first shoot outdoors with it, so I'll put a link to that one up at the top of this video and also in the description below. So if you want to see that one, feel free to check it out. If you've enjoyed watching and you'd like to see more of my content, more of my shoots using this lens and more of the images that I take, then be sure to subscribe to my channel. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see you in a future video.